Constellations Remembered. A frost had seeped into the heart of every child who sailed to Greenland on that first voyage. Not even the sun could thaw it, not even the stars. The grown among them might have been strong enough to bear the cold without breaking, but no such mercy was given to the young, and least of all to Fiola Lovenskiold, who learned early what the frost could do to a youthful heart. Her parents, like the other Danish sailors abroad, had steered through 2,000 miles of dark water and titanic icebergs to reach this strange new land. They used guesswork maps and rusted compasses, and when those things failed them, they sailed by faith, by the planets, and by the stars. They knew, above all, to trust the stars above, to guide them on their journeys to new and beautiful places. The company, perhaps 70 Danish men and women with their children, were less than 100 miles from the Arctic Circle when Greenland's shores first appeared. Large, heavy flakes were falling, frosting the woman's hair and turning the men's beards to ivory. By then, the frost had done its work. It had sunk deep into the children, beneath skin and muscle, into marrow and soul, and there it made a quiet home. There was nothing to be done. It was inside them now, part of them, and they would carry its coldness through life and into their graves. In each young heart, the frost twisted and grew, finding its own strange shape. Everyone bore the frost, in some way, small or vast. Fiola's father wrestled with a silent hunger for spirits. Her mother battled an anger that rose suddenly, feverish across her cheeks. But in Fiola, the frost had turned into a vast emptiness, deep as loneliness, wide as despair. A chasm rooted itself in her bones, mute and enduring. Hours after the company made sight of land, their vessel ran aground at the shores of the site now called Kulusuk, the ship splintering and filling with seawater. The shipwreck was calamitous. Friends, children, and rations all swept away. Yet, somehow, amid the grief and the wreckage, the first thing the survivors did was step onto land and offer thanks. From the broken bones of their vessel, they built a chapel, stuffing its seams with mud and grass. They crowned it with a tiny white cross, draped its altar with polar bear fur, and lined its pews with sealskin. And there, in that makeshift sanctuary, they gathered and knelt and gave thanks. Against all odds, the settlement grew. The year was 1918. A young physicist named Albert Einstein had begun to shape a strange theory of relativity, one that claimed time could stretch and bend, and that space itself was alive. A generation earlier, Giovanni Schiaparelli had mapped faint thread-like canals on the surface of Mars, etching questions that no telescope could yet answer. And now, the Mount Wilson Observatory had raised the largest telescope ever built, an enormous glass eye turned towards the heavens, straining to read the stars like scripture. The settlers at Kulusuk were living in a time of marvels and upheaval, and they spoke of it often as they huddled near the chapel's small fires, feeding the orange tongues with lichen and heather. No matter how bitter the cold, they guarded the warmth inside them like a candle's flame. If they hadn't, They may not have survived the long winter, that relentless train of months in which the daylight was a mere comma, punctuating a ceaseless dark. Of the wreck's survivors, only 2 children remained, Fiola Lovenskiold and a boy named Oystein. His parents had not survived the voyage, but the settlers, Fiola's family most of all, took him in as their own. From the first day, the 2 were inseparable. Whenever her father drank too deeply, or her mother's temper flared like heat lightning, they would slip away together to explore the wild edges of their new home. They were kindred explorers drawn to each other like sparks to dry tinder. When they were together, the world softened. Some would have called it friendship. Others might have called it something older than that. As the years unspooled, they grew closer still, until Fiola almost forgot the quiet frost she'd carried in her heart since the shipwreck. The 2 of them traipsed over the ancient Inuit lands together, where the Sakwa, then the Dorsets, and finally the Thule people had lived. They rode sledges over the hard tundra, up into the foothills of Mount Kaloruyurnek. They crossed frozen sounds together to see ice fjords and shifting glaciers and ground springs warm enough to bathe in. At the end of each adventure, they would always return to the little chapel in Kalusik. There, they would look out through the church's highest window at the night sky, a reminder that they could always trust the stars to guide them on their journeys to new and beautiful places. Fiola dreamed of one day becoming an astronomer, while Oystein dreamed of becoming a great explorer, though this hardly seemed possible. That first frost he'd taken in at sea had matured into a regular and grating cough that racked him in spasms. When he grew too ill to roam about with Fiola, she would give him a candle lit from whale oil and drag him nightly by the sledge to the chapel, where they would look up at the night sky, an inky eternity so wide and so close and unexplored that they could almost tumble into it where they stood. When the frost took its final toll on Oystein, the ground was too hard to take him. Fiola and her parents waited through months of silence, of cold, of grief, until the earth finally loosened. She laid a bouquet of flowers made from flannel at his grave, so the petals would never freeze away. For a time, there was only stillness. Then, slowly, her loneliness began to rise again, delicate and merciless, a frost that bloomed beneath the skin. And the world carried on as it always had, while she grew into a young woman. News arrived that the astronomer Cecilia Payne had discovered the chemical composition of certain stars. Around the same time, Edwin Hubble had found evidence that the heavens were expanding into a much larger creation. A new planet named Pluto was even identified, but Fiola showed little interest in these things. If she still held any longing for the stars, it flickered low, tucked away, like a story she had chosen not to tell. Each night, she lit her whale oil candle and walked alone to the chapel, where she would gaze through the highest window at the stars above. Then she would return to her parents' home, crawl into bed, and drift into impossible dreams. In some of her dreams, Oystein came to her, and they would travel through space into worlds untouched by loss. They witnessed ringed asteroids and planets covered with burning ice. They strolled across titanic stars large enough to create their own solar winds. Each night, when it was time for her to wake, she would ask him,
"May I stay and join you in the stars?"
He would reply,
"I must voyage. Voyage without you." For a little while longer.
She kept largely to herself in waking hours, treading alone over icy rills beneath northern lights of emerald and coral. When she could delay no longer, she was married to a whaler whose wife had not lived to see their settlement grow. Calusik, meanwhile, surged with trade and change until one evening she found a radio receiver in the back of the chapel, the place where she and Oystein had once sat, whispering to the stars. And so Fiola continued to light her whale oil candle, to walk to the chapel, to sit and listen to the radio, and to gaze at the stars. A static voice told her that a man named J. Robert Oppenheimer had determined the properties of neutron stars, and that James Van Allen had detected an enormous belt of comets just beyond Neptune. When Fiola's mother passed, they laid her beside Oystein's plot. Fiola placed a bouquet of cotton flowers at the grave, so the petals could never be taken by the frost. That night, she returned to her husband's bed, so full of grief that her only escape was in dreams. There, her mother came to her, younger now, unburdened, her face soft with peace. No anger touched her, not even the memory of it. Oystein was between them, and he took Fiola gently by the hand. Fiola's mother took the other, and together they drew her to planets made of diamonds and worlds that rained crystal and glass. She covered her mouth when they reached a molecular nebula, what Carl Henneze would later call a stellar nursery, made almost entirely of ethanol. It smelled rather like raspberries and tasted like rum, and she chuckled to imagine how her father would fancy the colossal cloud. When they had explored 1,000 planets in the cradles of 100 stars, and it was time for Fiola to wake, she asked,
May I stay and join you in the stars?
Her mother replied,
We must voyage. Voyage without you.
For just a little while longer.
Oystein finished her sentence. Years passed, and in time Fiola's belly swelled with life. She bore more than a few children for the whaler she had married. Despite the frost that still lingered in her, she showed kindness to her husband, tended to her aging father, and raised her children with great care. A television had found its way into their home, and she would huddle the family together after dinner time to watch the news broadcasts play across a wobbling screen. They saw the photographs that the Mariner 4 captured on its voyage past Mars. They watched Edwin Aldrin and Neil Armstrong set foot on the moon. Her children grew into fox trappers and polar bear hunters, and in the quiet hours of an emptied nest, Fiola returned, candle in hand, to the chapel of weathered planks and salted seams, to sit beneath the window where stars always waited. She stayed until the early hours, weeping softly, searching her heart for some small warmth, enough to believe there might still be a journey meant for her, enough to believe that the stars could still be trusted to lead her to new and beautiful places. Her father died, all too suddenly. She found him in bed, the fire gone out long ago, a bottle of Brennivin spirits still in hand. She buried him months later, laying a bouquet of silk flowers at his grave. She had traded many goods and hours of work for such rare fabric, but she knew, in the end, that its petals could never be taken by the frost. Fiola's dreams were heavy that night, until she saw her father in the stars. He was strapping and handsome, and without a single gray strand in his hairline. His arm was around her mother's shoulder, and the two were looking at each other like newlyweds. Oystein stood beside the pair, his eyes shining. Then, one by one, they reached for Fiola, and together they sailed into the stars. The four of them ventured to star embryos that spewed trillions of gallons of water per second from their north and south poles, to neutron stars that spun over 600 times per second. The family laughed and cried and paraded across gas giants and dwarf planets and countless worlds in between. For the first time Viola could remember, she was wholly, unquestionably happy, woven into the rhythm of a family that moved together like a constellation. Alas, the time came for her to wake. So she asked,
May I stay and join you in the stars?
We must voyage.
began Oystein.
Voyage without you.
Her mother continued,
For a little while longer.
finished her father. If you have felt the kind of grief that tore through Fiola when she woke in this world, then you must know, just as well as her, that grief, no matter how painful, will never stop the world from turning. It was not long before Fiola's children had children of their own, who grew and wandered and took flight from the airport that had been built in Kalusuk. Her grandchildren returned now and then, eager to share all they'd seen, the distant places, the things that once seemed impossible, and all that the world had become. They brought with them little movie clips from the World Wide Web, Spirit rover touching down on Mars, an astronaut who had lived a year in space, the discovery of hundreds of Earth-like exoplanets. Even in sorrow, news of the stars pulled at a small place in Fiola that still remembered what it was to long for something bright. She was the oldest woman in the settlement now, a folk legend amongst the children, who whispered stories about the woman who still spoke to stars. Some stayed up late to try and glimpse her, hobbling through the snowdrifts, scarf flaring, a whale oil candle flickering in hand as she made her way to the old chapel. One night, alone at her pew, Fiola finally understood. She did not want to die. Not because her long life had been kind, but because it hadn't. And it was not life that had taken so much from her. It was death. Death had been such a patient burglar, slipping through the cracks of her life, taking her childhood, her family, her one great joy. And now, again, it waited. How could she go gently, knowing it would mean surrendering what little was left unstolen? The highest window of the chapel had begun to frost at its corners. She looked past her candle, up at the constellations and the slow drift of some orbiting satellite, but felt no kinship with the old Inuit star watchers, those ancient souls who took such joy in carving the moon's phases onto bones now buried. Cold crept further against the window pane, feathering the glass until only a thumbprint of sky remained. Her candle flickered once, flared amber, and went out. Fiola closed her eyes. The frost that once crept at the edges of a little girl's heart had finally, at last, hardened into stillness. Fiola could see nothing when sensation began to return, but she felt hands at her shoulders, her knees, and at the small of her back. Wherever they touched, the frost inside her melted, and she felt herself becoming something new, a girl from before the winter ever found her. She knew the hands, of course. She had known them all her life, her mother's, her father's, and Oystein's, the hands that had lifted her from shipwreck and never truly let go.
May I stay and join you in the stars?
Her eyes opened as the old question slipped from her lips. This time, no one answered. She didn't need them to. As she began to shine with light, she understood at last. She had never been alone. The frost had only ever been a waiting place. She linked arms with the constellation she called family, and together they rose into an ever-expanding sky, towards stars that would guide them still to new and beautiful places.